Erotic email. Presented by Stillafrog.
She opened her eyes suddenly at 2:30 a.m., which was strange by itself, because once she'd fallen asleep, she practically never woke up, except on rare occasions when something startled her. And tonight, nothing had. There wasn't even an electronic glow under her door or the telltale clicking of a keyboard. So it wasn't that her teenage son was illicitly playing after-curfew online video games. Stranger still was that there was no message from him. They'd been talking by phone for 2 weeks, emailing for twice that long, and starting very early on, he'd written to her every night by now. She never read what he'd sent until her alarm went off at 6:15 on weekdays. However, the emails always came before about 2 o'clock. But it was a half hour past that, and there was nothing. So she put her phone back on the night table, and then, just before rolling over, she checked one last time. And there it was. The mere fact that it had come in would have been enough. She would have happily read it in the morning when she always did, if she hadn't noticed the first line. I hope tonight wasn't too desolate because the last thing I want to think about is you sitting, figuratively, by yourself at the open until long after midnight, drunk dialing your ex cafe. When she saw the words, she immediately opened the message that she'd started writing to him hours ago. She was certain that she'd not sent it, but she checked anyway, and sure enough, it was still in her drafts folder, already 3 paragraphs. However, all she noticed was the first line. Tonight has been particularly desolate, the kind of evening that makes me understand what drives someone to drunk dial an ex. She knew it was just a coincidence. She'd mentioned the desolate feeling in an earlier phone conversation, and he'd thought the word was particularly descriptive. He'd also laughed when she'd said something about drunk dialing. He'd even told her that he'd never heard the term before. But still, this did not feel like coincidence. It felt like something that was meant to be. In fact, the whole thing had felt vaguely like, she hated to say it, but like the hand of fate. As if they were somehow connected emotionally, each of them aware of what the other one was thinking and feeling, and it had felt that way from the very beginning. She had initiated contact with him on a dating site, despite the fact that he was 9 years older and 2 hours away. Or maybe she'd done it because he was older and far away. 3 years earlier, she'd ended a 5-year affair, even though she still wasn't really over it, and part of the reason for ending it was that she just couldn't believe she'd actually had it. It was such a cliche. Married man promises to leave his wife and kids, get a divorce, and marry her. He strings her along for half a decade and would still be doing it if she'd not finally walked out. It seemed to her like such a tawdry, tacky, low-life thing, being complicit in all the lies, like she'd completely abandoned all her standards. Or, even more demeaning, like she'd never had any standards in the first place. There was also the fact that her son, who'd been in elementary school when it started, had not known that the guy was married, but had really liked him. So how was that going to play out when it eventually came to light that the man had left his own kids for someone else's? On top of that, there was her feeling that she'd been played for a fool, along with the ever-present question that she always ignored. If he'll do this to his current wife, why do I think he won't do it to me? And as if that wasn't enough, there was also the perception, shared by her family and friends, that she was a victim. The worst part, however, by a very wide margin, was that despite the fact that it sounded so low rent, and in many ways it probably was, and despite the fact that she could have never imagined herself doing such a thing, there was a depth to it that she'd never experienced before or since. And for that reason, that man was still in her heart. So she honestly wondered why she'd written to an older man who was far away. Until now, her consorts had always been slightly younger. Did she really want 5-year guy to finally become Auld Lang Syne? She loved that song. Old Long Since, the haunting melody, the wistful lyrics about love lost and the fleetingness of time. Did she really want the memory of the man with whom she'd felt such completeness was the only word. Did she really want that memory to begin quietly slipping out of the here and now and slowly floating backwards into the earlier seasons of what so often seemed like someone else's life? A place where it would eventually be obscured in the mists of her distant past? Was she truly ready for that? Did she really want to fall in love again? And had she written this guy because his profile was so good that she thought he might be the one? Or was she actually hoping to do exactly the opposite by finding a suitable man to fill that occasional partner role for social events, some holidays, and a few weekends? Was she looking for a man like that precisely so that she could avoid falling in love? She didn't have a clue. What she did know, however, was that this had not been what she'd expected, not from a dating site anyway, because even though they'd never met, he would frequently, out of the blue, write or say something that resonated with her, powerfully, something insightful or maybe even very moving, something that made her heart sing and her spirit soar. And therein lay her dilemma, because mind-altering, earth-shaking, otherworldly religious experience, epic sex, had been one hallmark of the affair with 5-year guy. She didn't know if the sense of completeness caused the profoundly fulfilling sex, or if the sex caused the sense of completeness. And she didn't care. She just knew that she wanted both, and that now there was some guy 2 hours distant and 9 years older who was conjuring up the ghosts of that completeness, but he was doing it with words. And since they hadn't even been in the same zip code together, she had no idea whether she'd be attracted to him at all, let alone have the kind of physical joy with him that she now knew was possible. And she didn't want to live without. So, with all of that swirling through her brain, she began to read the rest of his message. It was like many that he'd sent before in that it struck a deep chord, and yet it was also utterly different, because he was writing about sex. Sex with her. Sex and lovemaking in the wee, small hours of the morning. And it was amazing because even though he didn't use a single word that would be considered remotely sexual by itself, the ordinary words that he did use came off the page as if by magic and spontaneously formed into a mental image that was both wildly erotic and wonderfully loving. Most surprising of all, however, she realized with a start that for the first time in almost a decade, her mental image did not include 5-year guy. She tried to write back, but she could come up with nothing. So she just lay there thinking until sometime later, when she finally drifted off. She was still pondering what to say as she dressed for work when his text came in. He was worried that he'd overstepped. She texted back that she'd call him on her way into the office, and then she sent another text. No, you didn't overstep. She waited until she'd parked in the garage before she called. She didn't want to be distracted by traffic. And when he picked up, she said, "Just listen, don't say anything. You didn't overstep. I've been expecting this. Wanting it, in fact, and I know we've talked about a good time to meet, but I want you to come now. Tonight. I can't stay with you if you get a hotel room because it's a school night. You can't stay with me, not yet, and I hate to ask you to go back so late, but I want us to meet. So see what you can work out and text me. I'll call on my way home, okay?" He said okay. They hung up, and she walked into the building with something she'd been waiting for. An answer. She didn't know if she could or would ever have a life with this man. What she did know, however, is that she wanted to try.
Want to hear more about fall-down laughing first date disasters, hilarious online dating nightmares, and even that rare, magical meeting that turns into a romance for the ages? Download our free app, A New True Story Every Day, the ever-entertaining comedy of the attraction between men and women.